First off, I just want to welcome everybody to our gathering tonight. Spirit Journeys has been a project of love since the early days of the AIDS epidemic, when the queer community found itself not knowing how to do community because we had been isolated from each other and in secrecy for so long, and living out lives that were plagued by anonymity and a sense of threat. And in those days, we found our need to come together and build community was so extraordinary. And the community that arose out of that continues to thrive today. Spirit Journeys was one of the first organizations to create spaces where people could be both queer and spiritual. At that time, there weren't many synagogues or sanghas or churches that held spaces for us. And so this was a space where people could come together and find a way towards their own wholeness. And now, all these years later, I find myself helping to create spaces still, as so many do these days. Well, in those early days, there were a few of us who didn't just call us together as communities, but who called us to a deeper vision of who we were as people and the gifts that we brought into the world. There were people who had a voice that we recognized as having a deep authority that called us back to ourselves and gave us the courage to be those selves in the world. And Eli Andrew Ramer was one of those voices and still is one of those voices. And I am deeply honored to call him my beloved friend. We met on a porch filled with rocking chairs in the Rocky Mountains, in the Smoky Mountains. I guess it was a little over 20 years ago, and was deeply compelled by that vision. It wasn't until the early pandemic, though, that he and I really connected, and we discovered a shared passion and for our community and for this world in a time when it deeply needs people to come together. Well, I will also read you his official bio. It's useful to read because it gives us a chance to take a few breaths, and him too, but also because it's extraordinary how much Eli has given over these years. Eli is a Maggid, a Jewish sacred storyteller who lives now in San Francisco, but was born in Queens, New York in 1951. And he believes that the prophetic tradition and storytelling are one and the same. The job of a storyteller is to create a narrative that holds a group together and forms the fabric of thought that a community or village of people inhabit. He grew into being a Maggid through many moments and teachers. He was spiritually formed through many communities, including the Gay Spirit Visions Conference in North Carolina and the New York Healing Circle, which flourished during the early AIDS years. His mentors, collaborators, and guides have included Charles Lawrence, Donna Cunningham, Harry Hay, Raven Wolf Dancer, Rabbi B'nai Lapp, and Rabbi Dev Noiley. He is a member and one of many lay leaders at Congregation Shar Zahav in San Francisco. And after many years of spiritual wandering, it was in Torah study with Dev Noiley at Shar Zahav that he found wisdom, comfort, and a rich new way to live as a queer Jewish man. Eli writes in a genre that he calls queer feminist speculative fiction theology, and is the author of 4 books of Midrash, Queering the Text, Biblical, Medieval, and Modern Jewish Stories, Torah Told Different, Deathless, and Fragments of the Brooklyn Talmud, and a 5th out now, Texting with Angels. He is also the author of one of the books that changed the hearts and the community of queer folk forever, Two Flutes Playing and Two Hearts Dancing, his more recent follow-up to that, Revelations for a New Millennium, Angel Answers, and a co-author of Ask Your Angels, The Spiritual Dimensions of Healing Addictions and Further Dimensions of Healing Addictions. and so much more writing that has yet to be released into the world, that will one day, I think, be a torrent that perhaps it's a second flood that brings a new covenant. Eli is a Lambda Literary Award finalist, and he lives up the street from an amusement park called Fairyland, appropriately enough, and may even be its muse. So with that, Eli, thank you for being here, and thank you for sharing a reading from your new book.
Well, thank you for that wonderful intro, Hunter, and thank you all for being here. I think it doesn't say in that bio that I was actually born across the street from an amusement park called Fairyland. And so I love that I now live up the street from Fairyland. I sometimes say to people, Freud talked about anatomy is destiny. And for me, I feel like it's geography. So I want to start out by reading you a tiny little story from my very first book, which is long out of print. It's called Little Pictures. And I wrote the stories over 17 years and illustrated them. And this, I don't know how well you'll be able to see this on the screen, but that's the first little picture that I want to show you. And the story is called The Novelist as a Child, and it will give you some background. As a child, the novelist heard voices and saw things that were not there. When he was very small, they said, "What a vivid imagination he has." When he was older, they sent him to various kinds of therapy. None of them worked at silencing the voices. They succeeded only in silencing the novelist. But not for forever, as you heard. The novelist went on to write a lot of things, including this. And one of the very lovely things is that the collage on the cover comes from my sister-in-law's new book. And when I saw her art, I'd seen her art before, but I fell in love with it and asked if I could borrow one. And if you're curious about her work, in the next to the last page in the book, you can find a reference to it. It's called An Annotated Awakening. And what she did is she spliced in images into the feminist classic novel, The Awakening by Kate Chopin, which I think was published in 1899. And all the collages are gorgeous, and the book is gorgeous. So I want to start out by reading the intro to this book, and then one of the stories, and depending on where we are with time, and Hunter, you and I can check in, we may take a little question and answer break, and then I want to read one other story. So the beginning of the book is called Variations on a Dream. For some reason, painters are allowed to paint the same scene over and over again. Think Monet's Cathedral Variations and Georgia O'Keeffe's Flowers. And musicians can explore variations on the same theme over and over again, too. Writers, however, are not supposed to repeat themselves. I don't know why. So be warned. There is only one plot here, told 10 times, about 11 of my favorite Western writers, one other figure from history, and 8 people introduced to me by my muses. Please note that the background for each author's life is historically accurate, more or less, until the moment I start to tinker with it. Here's a brief history of the book. On the night of May 29th, 1985, I dreamed that I was at a garage sale and came upon a boxed set of Jane Austen's collected works. It had exactly the same bindings and covers as the one my mother owned, only it was twice as wide because it included poems, novels, essays, and plays that Austen wrote after she moved to America, where she died some years later of old age. The book has other roots. Virginia Woolf writing about Shakespeare's sister Judith. My fascination with stories where the South won the war between states and the Nazis won the Second World War. Air pollution. We could be living without it if we'd made other choices than to be dependent upon automobiles. Solar energy. What would the world be like if Ronald Reagan hadn't been elected president, or was, but left the solar panels on the White House roof that Jimmy Carter installed? True stories are a co-parent of this book as well. My second mother, Irmgard Baum, and her mother and brother got out of Germany on the last sealed train upon which Jews could leave the country. She was 16, lost most of her family and friends in the Holocaust, and lived a very difficult life, riding long waves of depression, utterly single for 40 years. At age 80, after much resistance, she accepted a dinner invitation from a charming widower in her building who I would have gone out with myself, and told her so. They fell in love, and the last 3 years of her life with Dr. Richard Eisenberg cast a luminous light on her entire life, changing it backwards and forwards, which changed my life too. I had my Austen dream in 1985, and it continued to echo in my head. On August 10th, 2012, I wrote in my journal, instead of dying, Alexander the Great lives to conquer much of the known world and creates a unified empire that endures for hundreds of years, sharing his throne with a beloved companion, the Hephaestion of his youth. I went on to imagine a tale about Jane Austen that emerged from and played with my dream, and also imagined stories about George Eliot, Marcel Proust, Oscar Wilde, and about Virginia Woolf and her partner Doris Lefkowitz, who I'd mentioned in Mincha, a story in Queering the Text, published in 2010, about the first trans winner of a Nobel Prize in Literature. My journal notes also included a reference to Milk and Cookies, a still unpublished story. Instead of being murdered, Harvey Milk went on to become the governor of California, lost his bid for the presidency, created a global foundation for gay youth, and ended up working for the UN. The first story I actually wrote for this book during the summer of 2015 is the one about George Eliot. Then I wrote the story about Austen and continued on, never getting to Alexander the Great, or to another imagined tale that haunts me now during the autumn of 2022, when I wrote this little preface, as I read about the continuing invasion of Ukraine, where all of my grandparents came from. Emperor Nicholas II and Empress Alexandra of Russia have another son, also named Nicholas, who isn't, like Alexei, their only son in this reality, a hemophiliac. When his father is forced to abdicate, he succeeds him as Nicholas III, and his long life and reign changed the course of Russian history. No USSR. And naturally, he's gay. And then this little section ends with a quotation from one of my favorite writers, who you may know, Clarice Lispector. And it comes from her book, Agua Viva. And Lispector is sometimes called the Kafka of Brazil. So if you haven't read her, look her up. And what she wrote in that book is something that stays with me. I want an invented truth. So a few invented truths. And it's lovely to look at you. Wonderful writers are sitting here and dear friends and family. So thank you, thank you, thank you. So this story is called Deep in the Woods. Narratives and counter narratives dance. What is and what could have been spiral and twine, inviting us to consider what yet might be. In a time of increasing global degradation, we wish we'd pay more careful attention to the writings of naturalist Henry David Thoreau, going back for inspiration to Walden, A Year in the Forest, and his beautiful Minnesota essays, Under a Rose Moon. In a nation grown increasingly Buddhist, we return again to Thoreau, seeing him and his transcendentalist writings as a bridge between West and East, between communal and contemplative, grappling with how to live in the world, how to live with ourselves, and how to create a just system of government that balances both of those concerns. It's Thoreau, the abolitionist and social reformer, who is our teacher in Civil Disobedience, Life Without Principles, and the manuscript he left unfinished at his death in 1887, In the Image of Justice. I'll interrupt myself slightly to say that if you're curious about when writers lived and died, in the end of the book, there's a little chart that shows all of these writers' birth, actual death, and when they die in my reinvented reality. So in this book that I've invented for Thoreau to write, In the Image of Justice, he plays with biblical and Native American themes to establish a secular theology of right relationship with self, others, and the world. And lastly, we owe a huge debt to the elegant stylist whose work continues to inspire writers and thinkers in this country and around the world, which is ironic for the work of a small town boy whose best days were spent in two different cabins, so well documented in Walden and in his final masterpiece, Deep in the Woods. Born in 1817, the third of four children, Thoreau entered Harvard College at age 16, graduated, and went on to tutor and teach until a canoe trip when he was 22 awakened him to his true calling, to become a student and poet of nature. For some years, Thoreau lived with his mentor, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and his family, working as a handyman, editor, babysitter, and contributor to Emerson's transcendentalist magazine, The Dial. In 1847, he began the solo adventure he is famous for, living for 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days in a cabin on Emerson's property on Walden Pond. While some have quibbled about how solo that time actually was, his experience there and his book about it are fundamental for our modern culture. It's always a challenge to look back at someone's life from the present. Words, concepts, ideas, and identities that seem obvious and clear to us today cannot always be translated backwards. Most historians and even his contemporaries viewed Thoreau's character in his younger years as being cold. Today, we might call him repressed, wondering if he was genderqueer, bisexual, or simply gay. We know that he was devastated when Ellen Sewall rejected his marriage proposal, and we know about his attachment to Tom Fowler, the guide who he chose for his trip to the Maine woods, and later to Alec Therian, the Canadian woodchopper who visited him at Walden Pond. As to the warm letters he wrote to Emerson's wife's older widowed sister, Lucy, we can see them as both love letters and as the missives of a gay man to his best straight woman friend. Within weeks of each other, in January of 1842, Thoreau's older brother John and Emerson's young son Waldo died. Did that add another layer of contraction to the already restrained temperament? That we cannot know. But what we can be sure of is that for much of his adult life, Thoreau loved best words and the natural world, both of them equally. In 1835, Thoreau contracted what was then called consumption, today tuberculosis, and he suffered with ill health for many years afterwards. And what does that do to someone's heart or their libido? In those days, one cure for consumption was a change of climate. And in 1861, Thoreau's doctor suggested a trip to Minnesota. He set out in May of that year with a traveling companion, Horace Mann Jr., the 17-year-old son of Franz and an aspiring naturalist. They took a series of trains out west and had numerous adventures exploring the region, with which both of them richly documented, in addition to collecting specimens. During the trip, Mann wrote back to his family that Thoreau seemed much improved by their time on land and water. They had planned to return home to Massachusetts by steamship and then train, and spent their last few nights in St. Paul at the home of a fellow naturalist, the Prussian Jewish poet, Friedrich Baum. And if you're curious, this is where I start to tinker, because actually Thoreau will die a year after this time. On their second night there, Baum invited 6 other writers and naturalists to a gathering, among them a man named Peter White Crane, an Ojibwe native who'd been raised in his family's village and then educated at the local French Jesuit academy. Would that someone had been there with a cell phone to discreetly video the encounter of the man Thoreau simply called White Crane, the English translation of his Ojibwe name. We know little of his background, and ever discreet himself, Thoreau preserved little in his journal or other writings. A single photograph taken of the two of them a few years later reveals a gaunt face and a round face, and 2 sets of intense eyes, one pair light and the other dark. We know that Thoreau was 3 years older than White Crane, who as a European-educated native lived in multiple worlds. He spoke fluent English and French in addition to his mother tongue. And although he stood at the center of Baum's parlor on that warm spring evening in 1861, dressed as a proper American gentleman, in his own community, White Crane would have been called, in the parlance of the time, a berdache, from the French slang word for a boy prostitute that is itself derived from an Arabic word for a slave boy. Today, we would probably speak of White Crane as being third gender or two-spirit, a man who in his own community dressed in mixed male and female garb, served a role as ritual leader and shaman, and most often had intimate relationships with other men. But none of that was revealed that night, at least not verbally. What we know from Thoreau's journal is that 2 things happened by the glow of several recently invented kerosene lamps. That each tall, slim, and no longer young man felt a deep sense of kinship with the other, and that the 2 began a correspondence when Thoreau and Mann returned home to Concord in July. Their surviving letters are both intimate and clear, both coded and overt in the romantic language of the time, which permitted 2 men to long for each other in ways that would be culturally forbidden a generation later. Thoreau's family and friends were delighted to welcome home a happier, healthier man. But when he announced 6 months later that he would be moving to St. Paul in the spring, they reacted with shock and horror. We tend to think of Thoreau as a homebody, and he helps us to sustain this image of him, as when he wrote in his journal in 1857 that our favorite books are not by those who have traveled widely, but by those who, quote, lived the deepest and been the most at home, unquote. In fact, he had traveled a good deal in his home state and region before he made that journey west. And the reason he gave for his move was simple and true. Baum had offered to house him and to sponsor his exploration of the flora and fauna of the region, something that he and White Crane continued to do until his death a quarter of a century later. Thoreau deliberately arrived in St. Paul on the first anniversary of his meeting White Crane, who was waiting for him at the train station carrying a spray of flowers. Of the man who earlier had written both, quote, The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation, unquote. And, quote, the language of friendship is not words but meaning, unquote. We do know this. The desperation vanished during the time he shared with his beloved white crane, who outlived him by only 3 years. The work they did together was monumental, a vast compendium of the plants, trees, animals, and birds of the region, arranged by season, which biologists still make use of today. While Thoreau was working on his poetry and essays, White Crane was doing ethnographic studies of his own people. And a photograph taken of him in Ojibwe garb shows a still handsome man in his late 50s wearing a long fringed shawl covered with opulent floral beadwork that he designed and sewed himself. And then there are Thoreau's poems. Years earlier, he had gone to meet Walt Whitman, and their visit left each man both impressed and wary of the other. Thoreau's letters to Whitman from St. Paul did not survive. But we know from Whitman's letters to Thoreau, which did, that Thoreau had written something to Whitman that shifted their relationship. We can only speculate that he addressed his former reticence and wrote of the ways in which his relationship to White Crane had changed him, because their letters grew increasingly warmer and more intimate. And we have Whitman's lovely poem, My Friend's New Journey, penned upon hearing of Thoreau's death. For several years, Thoreau lived with Baum and his family, a curious repeat of his life with the Emersons. And then in 1866, a year after the Civil War had reached its brutal end, Thoreau and White Crane purchased land on the shores of Lake Superior, where they built a 2-room cabin, which became their home till Thoreau's death. The cabin was near White Crane's village. We know that the two spent time there, and from his writings, we can see the ways in which a society that honored difference welcomed and honored them. Reviving his old skills, Whitman taught English classes there, and White Crane taught him Ojibwe, which he picked up quickly, although White Crane always teased him about his terrible accent. During those years, White Crane wrote the book he's best known for, Living on Holy Ground, that study of what has come to be called ecology, and which remains a basic handbook for anyone who wants to live in harmony with the earth. His political work in St. Paul established a level of Native inclusion that spread to other states, and Minnesota was the first state in the Union to require all of its students to learn one native language. The slight aside, would that were a true story in this reality? Back to the fake story. We are also blessed to have Thoreau's glorious book about their time together, Deep in the Woods, published 5 years before his death, into which he was midwifed by White Crane. Thoreau's remains are interred in White Crane's village, and in the same plot of land he himself was interred 3 years later. The work of these two men lives on, and to this day, students around the world buy Thoreau's 2 classics, Walden Pond and Deep in the Woods, bound together in one thick volume. I still have the copy I bought in college, their only photograph on its cover, its pages yellow and crumbling on the rare occasions that I open it, sitting beside the newer edition that I keep going back to. Some of you may not know the White Crane Journal was one of the earliest gay men's sort of magazines and publications in this country, and possibly on the planet, at least in our time. So it's a kind of subtle little tribute to an amazing cultural gift. And several of my teachers, going back 40, 50 years, were Native American. And so I felt like I wanted to weave something in a way that was really meaningful. And if you do get the book and read the book, I've woven in several other characters. So Marcel Proust writes a story in a book in his longer life that is very much about a love relationship between an African man and a European colonizer, two men who meet and fall in love. The writer Colette falls in love with a woman who's Japanese. So I wanted to play with multiple cultures in some way and honor some of my teachers, particularly, and some of you may know him, Clyde Hall, and other teachers. So in part, I picked the story that I read from Little Pictures because it's a true story of me. As a little boy, I did hear voices. I was sent to therapy. And in my early description of, what did I say? There's only one plot here, told 10 times, about 11 of my favorite writers. One other figure from history, which is actually Leland Stanford Jr., who died, I think, at 14 or 15, and his parents named Stanford University after him. And then I wrote, and 8 people introduced to me by my muses. And so in a way, I feel that I literally believe in the presence of muses. You know, I have ancestors who were dead who come and talk to me. I know this happens to other people on the screen, guides, angels, spirits. And so very clearly for me that I had that dream. And in fact, I went online one day and I found a picture of the exact boxed set for sale for hundreds of dollars of Jane Austen books that my mom had, but it was way bigger, of course. And so did I set out to do this? No. Muses tapped me on the shoulder and said, hey, dude, we sent you a dream. I mean, I had the dream in 85. I didn't start writing about it until, I forgot what year did I write? 2015. So a long time went by. And one of my teachers years ago said to students who were having writer's block, don't even go in that direction. You don't have writer's block. You are pregnant with your next story. We just don't know how long you're going to have to carry it for. Could be 3 years. So just keep breathing, enjoy being pregnant. Don't negate the fact that you're pregnant. So I often think of a quote from the writer Joyce Carol Oates, who wrote something that's going to be close to the quote, but she wrote something, or it was in an interview. I don't understand why people make a big deal about me as a writer. I'm just a garden hose that the water flows through. And I get that. And several people I'm looking at, and I've read your amazing work. So I know, yeah, it's flowing through me. And I'm grateful to be a garden hose. And in this book, there are 2 stories that are amongst maybe my 4 favorite stories that I've ever written. And the last story, which is about Franz Kafka, is possibly my favorite story that I've ever written. But in the Department of Manipulative Marketing, if you haven't gotten the book, I'm not going to read that story. It's also rather long, and I'm going to read my second favorite story in the book. And it has a backstory to the story, which is that I was in a PhD program to get a degree in Near and Far Eastern studies. And long story of what happened to that. But one night, my stepmother sat me down and said, why are you doing this? You're a writer. And I never went back to my program. And maybe I would have been a writer. In a parallel reality, I want you to know that you are sitting with the world's leading authority on North Syrian ivory carvings of the 2nd millennia BC. Me. But that's not the journey I went on. But in the way that White Crane Journal, is referenced in this book, there are very subtle references to my stepmother, the building that she lives in, where I lived in a part of my life on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and our famous downstairs neighbor who I would have little chats with. So those parts are true. And references to Suzanne Shepherd, who I love and adore. And if you ever watched The Sopranos, My stepmother had a little bit part as, I can never remember her name, as Tony Soprano's wife's mother. So I am immensely proud of her and grateful endlessly because I wouldn't be a writer. I would be an archaeologist. And so, how many of you know Manhattan? Is my reference. This story is called A Wolf, W-O-O-L-F, A Wolf in Zabar's. Does everyone know Zabar's? Amazing, sort of incredible. Well, now you all have to go to Manhattan and you have to go to Zabar's on the Upper West Side, which is an incredible, sort of like gigantic Jewish deli. And the story is called A Wolf, W-O-O-L-F, in Zabar's. And the beginning is utterly true. For a paragraph. Prone to bouts of madness throughout her life, fearing that they were returning and that this time she would not be able to fight them off. On March 28th, 1941, Virginia Woolf left a brief goodbye note for her sister Vanessa, another one for her husband Leonard. Slipped out of their country home, Monk's house, and headed through the garden across a field toward the River Ouse with the intention of drowning herself. She'd recently finished a solid draft of a new novel, Between the Acts, which Leonard had praised, but she'd lost faith in it, and the voices she'd been hearing on and off for years had returned, fueled by the nightmares of the war and the bombing and destruction in London, which had forced them to leave the city. But this was something she'd thought about for years, and walking slowly along the banks of the river, she began to gather large stones, dropping them into the capacious pockets of her heavy winter coat. True. Exhausted after 3 months, without a single day off, on March 28th, 1941, American Army nurse Doris Lefkowitz, stationed nearby, left the barracks she was living in and headed off to explore the land around the River Ouse, which she'd read about in a regional guide she'd borrowed from one of the surgeons. It was a lovely morning, clear and blustery, with the faintest hint of spring in the air, the kind of weather she liked, bracing, wild around the edges. In her pocket, Lefkowitz carried a small herring sandwich wrapped in wax paper and a small thermos of coffee tucked into the purse, which hung from a long strap over her shoulder. She was exhausted physically and emotionally as the war dragged on, as the constant bombing of England continued. She was worn out from the agony, the hopelessness, the wounds, the mangled bodies, the blood, the screaming, the constant death. As she came around a bend in the road, she saw a lone figure ahead, wearing a dark overcoat, her head wrapped in a dark kerchief. She was walking along at a brisk yet odd pace, seeming to be both pushed ahead and yet held back at the same time. As she got closer, Lefkowitz could sense the thrust of the mission she was on, and watching the way her long winter coat hung, its pockets bulging, she understood. Not wanting to startle her, she was startled herself when the woman turned to her for a moment, a wild, desperate look in her eyes, then quickly looked away and continued on. But in that turning, Lefkowitz recognized her. She'd read many of her books, was deeply influenced by A Room of One's Own when she read it in Brooklyn College, and knew something of the story of her romantic friendship with Vita Sackville West, which had helped her in her own struggles with her slowly blossoming sexuality. She'd even heard Woolf speak a few years earlier on the radio, that elegant patrician voice coming out of the large wooden cabinet. She knew too a bit about her life, her mental instability, and as a nurse, even an exhausted nurse on her one day off in months, Doris Lefkowitz's brain was racing, desperate, as Woolf began to move out of range. Suddenly, remembering the rich, wonderful voice she heard before, she found herself calling out, "Excuse me, madam, excuse me," in a raw Brooklyn voice that seemed to jar the very air around them and shake the very few newly forming buds on the surrounding trees. Woolf stopped in her tracks, her patrician face trembling. Lefkowitz watched as with monumental will, Woolf rearranged herself and said in the rich, resonant tones that lived behind all of her extraordinary writings, "Yes, dear, can I help you?" Moving slowly, Doris Lefkowitz walked closer. "Thank you so much," she said, pausing a few feet away. "I seem to have gotten myself lost." Woolf sighed and with a forced smile said something neither of them could remember later. Lefkowitz came closer and said, "I am so lost and so desperately cold," although she was neither. And Woolf responded just as she hoped she would. She informed the young woman that she lived nearby and invited her home for a cup of tea, which Lefkowitz accepted, ignoring the coffee in her purse as she ignored the stones in Woolf's pockets. And in that moment, the smile that Lefkowitz gave Virginia seemed to fill her soul, to feed her in a way that she had not felt in years. She did not know yet that Lefkowitz, who soon introduced herself and was wearing her one civilian outfit, was a nurse. She did not know that that nurse had noted the stones dragging her down. And she did not know yet that that younger woman with the strange accent she could only identify as New York would soon slip an arm through her own as they turned to walk back to the house. Years later, Woolf wrote about that day, how Doris began to chat about the trees, about how much she loved England, about her hope that the war was coming to an end, in a manner that was both comforting and curiously engaging to someone intent on taking her life just moments before. And when, moments later, a long-faced man in a straw hat came racing toward them, his coattails flapping behind him, Woolf had forgotten about the suicide note she'd left behind. Doris had recognized the husband and did what she'd done before. She called out, "Oh, hello, you must be Mr. Woolf. I'm Doris Lefkowitz, and your wife and I are having such a delightful chat." Leonard himself wrote some years later how different that day might have gone, and I will cry because it didn't go this way. Woolf himself wrote some years later how different that day would have gone if Doris Lefkowitz had not appeared out of the blue, if she had not been a trained healer, if Virginia had not been so well brought up, and lastly, if Doris had not been Jewish, and therefore already family. Looking at the two of them, wife and stranger arm in arm, he knew that something significant had happened. Relieved beyond belief, but startled beyond imagining, utterly trusting the strange American Jewess, he said nothing about the note or his terror as the three of them headed back to the house, where Virginia shrugged herself out of her coat and stuffed it in a corner behind an armchair, while their guest looked around with curiosity as Leonard put up a kettle for tea they made from plants they grew in their garden. Then the three sat down at the table and continued to chat about this and that, Leonard never taking his eyes off Virginia, she always looking away. But Leonard could see his wife relaxing, and he watched the way she looked at the rather lovely red-haired stranger with great relief that only a man such as he, who has gone through so much already with Virginia, could ever allow himself to feel. "You look rather tired," Doris said to her hostess, who suddenly realized that she was. "Why don't you go lie down for a while?" Leonard added, "Whoops, wrong accent. Why don't you lie down for a bit? Leonard added, to which a weary Virginia replied, yes, I think that I shall. She thanked their guest, invited her to come back, and went off to her bedroom, leaving Leonard and Doris to fill each other in on what had happened, each as horrified and relieved as the other. The notes which he showed her, the stones in her pockets, which they'd all ignored, the darting look in Virginia's eyes, which seemed to slow and almost fade as they sat there talking, all persuaded Leonard to say to Doris, my wife seems to trust you instinctively. This has happened to her a few times before, and it's always meant a great deal to me. So I do hope that you will return again as often as you like. Doris assured him that she would as often as she could, given her work. In the weeks and months that followed, Virginia, resting under the care of her old physician friend, Octavia Wilberforce, slowly returned to health, and even went back to work on what became the final marvelous draft of Between the Acts. In all of history, there has been perhaps no more curious a courtship than that of Doris Lefkowitz and Virginia Woolf, entirely conducted under the watchful, loving eyes of a cautious and grateful husband. He'd seen the agony that his wife went through during her fiery relationship with Sackville West, and knew that it had been doomed as much by Virginia's fragile emotional state as it was by her lover's monumental ego. But Doris was different, caring and warm, passionate in a grounded way he recognized from the women in his own family. And it was he who sat Doris down about a year after they met, as the war was still raging, and said, all I want is for Virginia to be happy, and you can give her a kind of happiness that I am not capable of. For years, Leonard and his second wife, Lydia, would vacation with Virginia and Doris, who moved to New York after the war was over. Some years they all met up on Cape Cod, where Virginia and Doris bought a small cottage on Truro Beach. And other years, they rendezvoused back at Monk's house, where they'd all had tea together that first afternoon. Virginia and Doris found a large apartment on the Upper West Side. This is back to my reference to where I lived and where my stepmother has lived since 1946, I believe. Virginia and Doris found a large apartment on the Upper West Side, in a building much populated by Europeans in exile. While Virginia rode and explored the city, Doris went on to medical school and then worked for many years as a pediatrician. And yes, there were times when Virginia struggled with depression and flickers of madness. But post-war New York was a city of art and jazz and psychotherapists, many who'd fled from Nazi Europe. And all of that, grounded in her relationship with Doris, kept Virginia on an even keel. Plus, Doris, through her cousin Milton, who taught at Columbia, landed Virginia a part-time teaching job there, where she was able to teach in lectures she desired. In fact, till the year she died. I remember my mother telling me that she'd heard Virginia Woolf speak at the 92nd Street Y. She said that Woolf was the most open and compassionate human being she had ever encountered. And I think about those iconic photographs of her, the amazing London ones taken by Man Ray in the 1930s, and the Manhattan studio portraits of her taken by Richard Avedon in the 1950s, so elegant in her mid-70s. But my favorite is the one that Diane Arbus snapped of her in 1961, standing in the courtyard of the Museum of Modern Art on a windy day, holding her big floppy hat to her head. She was 79, as I believe some people might be here today. She was 79, her magnificent face lined and utterly exquisite, looking into the camera with sheer, almost childlike delight. At that age, she was still teaching and still writing, In fact, she was yet to start, even conceive of her last and most famous novel. So let's call to mind the highlights of her canon: Mrs. Dalloway, To the Lighthouse, The Waves, Between the Acts, A City in Spring, The Gilman Sisters, In a Garden of Pleasure, and her last great masterpiece, Quite Simply, that delicious prose poem to Doris, along with all of the books of essays, the book of Thoreau poems about their extensive garden, Seaworthy, the collected letters, the 5 volumes of short stories, the 7 illustrated children's books, all written for one or another of Doris's nieces and nephews. Another little aside footnote, the Gilman Sisters was inspired by the fact, and I'm looking at my cousin Eileen now, that our maternal lineage were Gilmans. So back to the story. This is true, this next part, but this is back to the story. We know how cruel the earlier Woolf had been to Leonard, once telling her sister at dinner to, quote, feed the Jew, unquote. But in New York, with Lefkowitz, she changed, mellowed. After all, the iconic photographs of her were all taken by Jews. Arbus becoming a close friend over the years, Woolf her confidant and counsel when she herself was contemplating suicide. And how can we not mention Woolf's one astonishing literary collaboration, A Tale of Two Voices, the Dickensian novella about Manhattan that she wrote with her good friend and downstairs neighbor, Isaac Bashevis Singer. Again, my little footnote, who was, we lived on the 12th floor, he and his wife lived on the 7th, in the Belnord, a magnificent building that occupies the entire block between Broadway and Amsterdam and 86th and 87th. So go pay a visit. Back to the story. There are all those interviews with her. I love to watch them on YouTube, talking about art, politics, history, music, articulate, engaging, and funny in constantly unexpected ways, telling Jewish jokes with her British Yiddish accent, which I'm not capable of, but I'll try. There was a man from Minsk who traveled to Pinsk. I also like to watch the interview Doris did with Barbara Walters 3 years after Woolf died, when her collected essays were being released. Through Lefkowitz's kind hazel eyes, we can picture Virginia in Zabar's, the Upper West Side's famous self-described, quote, gourmet Epicurean emporium, unquote. On a Sunday morning, the New York Times under her arm, buying bagels and lox for their breakfast. We can spy on the two of them taking Esperanto classes at the New School, bent over the same faded secondhand textbook. Esperanto, the international language created by L.L. Zamenhof, the Polish Jewish pacifist, peering out into a better, if still unattained, future. And think about Woolf's amazing circle of friends on several continents. And remember the annual seminar she led at Isola, the art colony founded by Oscar Wilde and Leland Stanford in California, which influenced several generations of queer writers. Looking back at the culture of great books and the contributions of centuries of dead white men, I know that everyone singles out one book by George Eliot as our greatest literary work. But I find it heartening to know that when we look at the total of Western writers, all critics agree that at the summit is Virginia Woolf, a female Moses, standing in her study, pen in hand, for she always wrote standing up, like an artist at her easel, looking out over Broadway to the Hudson River. Sitting on the desk beside her, an old Yartsite glass of black unsweetened tea and a blue and white flower painted plate of Doris's homemade poppy seed roglach. Okay. So usually often in the back of the book, there's the author bio, where you get to read about who the author is. So I wrote 2. One I called fictional, and it is, and the other I called factional, and that's the true one. I'm going to read the fictional one with a little bit of pause on it, but I think you'll understand why I chose it. I was born on March 24th, 1951, but this is all fictional. Not entirely. Andrew Omar Ramer was born in Paris on March 24th, 1951. When he was 5, his British diplomat father and Persian journalist mother moved to Tokyo, where his sister Lynn was born. And when he was 10, the family moved to Washington, D.C. In 6th grade, his teacher, Jerome Winetsky, read the class Robert Frost's poem, The Road Not Taken, which begins, quote, 2 roads diverged, unquote. Shaken to the core, Ramer went home, wrote his first poem, and never stopped writing. Ramer studied English literature at Harvard, but his sister Lynn encouraged him to abandon his dissertation on lesbian subtexts in the novels of the Bronte sisters and devote himself to his own writing. In 1976, he moved to Seattle to be with a man he met at a writing conference, who soon dumped him. But he stayed there, got a job in a used bookstore, and finished, illustrated, and sold his first book, Little Pictures, which he began writing in college. The book was edited by Chris Cox and published in 1977. His second book came out in 1980, 22 Views of a Life, an autobiography told through objects, also edited by Cox. Later that year, Ramer moved in with Argentinian poet Raul Meller, who he met under the trees at an outdoor Shabbat service. And the following year, he wrote in his journal, quote, a new disease has stormed in, like a fire-barfing dragon, unquote. Raul was diagnosed with AIDS in 1983 and died in 1984. When the HIV test was approved in 1985, Ramer took it, knowing what the results would be. It was then that he completed his next book, 4 Roads Diverged, in which he explored the ways that English and American literature would have been different if Charles Dickens and Mark Twain had died as young men, and how Jewish storytelling would have been different if Sholem Aleichem and I.L. Peretz had also died young. Forever After was Ramer's next book, a queer retelling of the lives of 20 of his famous favorite writers, starting with the biblical prophetess Huldah, Sappho, and the medieval Spanish rabbi Yehuda Halevi, who wrote love poems to young men that Ramer was never taught about in Hebrew school. They're followed by stories about Sufi poet Jalaluddin Rumi, philosopher Baruch Spinoza, haiku writer Matsuo Basho, and of course, the Bronte sisters, Charlotte, Emily, and Anne, along with stories about George Sand, Nikolai Gogol, Walt Whitman, D.H. Lawrence, Zora Neale Hurston, Juna Barnes, Dorothy Parker, Langston Hughes, Clarice Lispector, Yukio Mishima, and his beloved partner, Raoul. 9 months after Forever After was published, following the path of writers including Anna Akhmatova and Fyodor Dostoevsky, who was not one of his favorites, Ramer took all of his unpublished work, typed stories, novels, essays, poems, and the 47 composition notebooks in which he'd been keeping his handwritten journal, out to the patio behind his Queen Anne Hill home, where he and Lynn burned them in the barbecue pit that he and Raoul built when they bought the house. Ramer died of AIDS 10 days later, on September 15th, 1987, the 100th anniversary of Thoreau's death. And I have to do one more show and tell very quickly. I have to go grab a photograph. So my sister Lynn in the stories, and I cry, is two pictures. So Lynn and I met in around 1975. This picture is actually taken of her at my 60th birthday party. And I think this was taken when I first moved to Oakland, so 7 years ago. So Lynn was my most beloved friend, and we called each other sister and brother. We knew parts of each other's families. I have a brother named Richard. She had a brother named Richard who died of AIDS, who I adored. And she died in October. And so I wrote the story having her be my sister before she died. But she's one. So two of my lovers who died of AIDS, the book is dedicated to, and Irmgard, who was my second mother, and who I took care of when she was dying, and Chris Cox, my editor, who really was my editor. If you ever know about the Violet Quill, it was a gay men's writing collective, and several really famous gay men who were writers were in it, but right now I can't remember any of them. So a piece of this book really is kind of echoing out of what you were saying about, and I'm going to look up fictons. You know, I just got struck by a lot of fictons, and I feel blessed. Even in my sorrow and missing Lynn a lot. And she's the person, when I first changed my name, I changed it from Andrew to Elias, which was my chosen middle name in 1988. And one day Lynn said, after almost 50 years, I can't call you Elias. Could I call you Eli? And I said, oh, I like that. And then one day I got a phone message from a cousin who said, I'm sorry, I love you, but like after my whole life of knowing you, I can't call you Elias. And then some months later, she left me a message saying, oh, I like calling you Eli. So I feel like this renaming also connects me to my sister. Well, there might be a sequel. The book that I'm working on now is so different, but it's a different kind of sequel. It's called When People Still Lived on the Earth, or All of Human History from Beginning to End and What Happened Afterwards. And it's this utterly dystopian story about what happens to all of our souls after we've ruined the capacity for life to go on this planet. But it's somewhat comic. So I am grateful. And in a way, I mean, for me, when I read the fictional author bio, it made me really happy because in the fictional bio, Lynn outlives me and goes on and inherits the house. And who knows? Thank all of you for being here and lingering and staying with me. I don't know all of you, but I know many of you. And this for me was just such a gift. So thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you.